Whoa, hold on. Is Cryo Infusion actually viable? No, there's no way. What's up everybody? Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about the potential and the viability of a Eula Cryo Infusion comp. Before we start, I'm going to go over the changes to Eula's skills and her buffs. Also, in the game's current state, the Infusion comp probably isn't going to be able to compete with the full physical set, but nonetheless, I was pretty interested to see how it would compare. So let me level set with you guys and explain how the Cryo Infusion comp can potentially compete with the full physical set. The pacing of the cryo damage needs to be higher than her burst physical damage, and what I mean by that is that her cryo infused auto attacks and her elemental skills need to be sufficiently stronger and be executed at a higher rate than the damage that comes from her physical set's elemental burst, passive skill, and auto attacks. With the Cryo Infusion comp, we can also think about melt damage. That also needs to be significantly higher than the physical damage build. Melt damage, however, is in a weird spot with how Cryo Infusion build works, and I'll touch on that weirdness later on in the video. And then lastly, a C1 Eula is going to grant her extra physical damage to her normal attacks, so a Cryo Infusion comp past C1 is not going to be good, so I won't even consider it. We're just going to take a look at Cryo Infusion for a C0 Eula. So let's go ahead and jump into her changes and her buffs from my last video. So her normal attacks have been buffed. I'm going to show you a side-by-side comparison of the increase in percentage for her normal attack at talent level 8. This buff is quite significant in my opinion because she ends up having the highest total scaling of every Claymore character in the game currently. Her attack string is also the most unique out of all Claymore characters. Most only have 4-hit combos, and as far as I'm aware, Beidou is the only other Claymore character that has a 5-hit combo. Eula, however, does have double hits mixed in there, so she truly is very unique in terms of her auto attacks. So after the buff, her normal attack scaling reaches nearly 1000%. Again, like I just said, that is the highest out of every Claymore character out there currently, but it does mean that she might take the longest to do her full string. We'll have to compare and see when she comes out. And yes, I do know that there are leaks out there that showed her insanely fast attack speed, but those are all leaks and development builds that might not be 100% reflective of her release version. So we can't go off of it, so just make sure to keep your expectations in check. When she comes out, I will definitely be doing a side-by-side comparison of her attack speed compared to the other Claymore characters. Next is her elemental burst buff, and it is actually now the same as her E-skill hold version. I actually did not realize that her elemental burst actually had a lower scaling than her hold E skill, so this is great. The physical portion was also buffed a bit in that the stacks now provide us a little bit extra damage. And now her new Ascension Phase 4 passive skill. The skill now instantly resets her E skill and grants her a single stack of Grimheart when she uses her elemental burst. This sounds pretty great, but just remember that her burst is an 80 cost and has 20 seconds of cooldown. Of course, that is subject to change. With this new passive skill, it does mean that we do kind of have to turn on our brain a little bit when it comes to her rotations. So basically, she now kind of has two different rotations. If you watched my previous video on Eula, the rotation that I talked about there is still viable. But now, if you are close to your burst, or if you do have it, you're going to have a new rotation. It's going to depend on your current stacks of Grimheart. These rotations are totally subject to interpretation, so I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts, but this is what I was able to come up with. We want to try to have 2 stacks of Grimheart before unleashing the hold version of our E skill. So keeping that in mind, if you have 0 stacks of Grimheart, I would use the press version and then use the elemental burst, then use the hold version. Using the press gives us 1 stack, and then using the burst will give us our 2nd stack and an instant reset on our elemental skill. So this basically allows us to use all of our skills in quick succession and gives us 2 stacks of Grimheart. This is going to give us the mini Lightfall Sword and the res debuffs and 2 Ice World procs. The next would be if you had 1 stack of Grimheart. If you have just 1, I would use the hold version anyway, then burst, then use a press version. This is going to give you the res decrease, but not the mini Lightfall sword. I value this because it's going to be resetting the 10-second cooldown on her E skill as opposed to the 4-second from her press version, so it's a better value in that specific regard. This sets us up with 2 stacks after the burst because we just need to wait another 4 seconds in order to use the hold version. This is ultimately going to let us capitalize on the res decreases with the hold version of her E skill. If you have 2 stacks already, then you should 100% use the hold version. You will get all of the benefits and it resets a 10-second cooldown elemental skill. Afterwards, use your burst and a press version of her E skill, and this is going to set you up pretty nicely with 2 stacks of Grimheart. All you gotta do is wait 4 seconds for the press version to come back off of cooldown. So with these new rotations, the good news is that you'll actually have to think about which version of her E skill to use depending on whether or not you have your burst or are close to it. And this might be a good thing depending on who you ask. Personally for me, I think it's going to make her gameplay a little bit more spicy. And now, in my previous video, I did mention the potential of the Sacrificial Greatsword for Eula and the potential to get stacks really fast. This new passive may hinder that potential somewhat, but on my channel, I'm still going to give it a try and see how it's going to do. So you guys can definitely look forward to that. Okay, now let's talk about Eula's melt, because there are quite a few problems with it. Starting with the Cryo Infusion comp, it's going to have lots of melt issues. Those issues being that the Pyro character is going to be the one that causes the melt reaction instead of Eula. Although the multiplier is higher, the damage itself isn't going to be higher unless the applicator is actually leveled up and invested into. With the Cryo Infusion comp, Eula is going to be applying Cryo way faster than Pyro, so Eula is not going to be the one causing those melt reactions. So in a little bit here, when we take a look at the graphs and the numbers, we have to keep that in mind. The physical build, on the other hand, may have a slightly easier time controlling Eula's melt because she's mainly going to be doing physical attacks. It's going to be much easier to time your skills to be melted when the enemy is afflicted by Pyro. However, if we do decide to run Lisa for Superconduct, the persistent Electro from her elemental burst can interfere with that. We'll have to see how easy it actually is to melt her damage when she fully releases. You also are going to have to use one of Eula's E skills in order to trigger Superconduct, meaning we can't actually melt every single one of her cryo hits. So these are all just good things to think about and some of the problems that I was able to think of as I was making this video. If there's anything else that I missed about her potential melt problems, please let me know down in the comments. Alright, now let's just go over the builds and comps that I used for these calculations. For the Omega Full physical build, I am using a Serpent Spine instead of the Snow-Tomed Star Silver. So we are missing on a little bit of physical damage bonus, but we are still running a physical goblet and the 4-piece Pale Flame set. Our team is going to be Zhongli, Lisa, and Xinyan for 20% shred, superconduct, 15% defense down, and Xinyan's extra 15% physical damage bonus and physical res down. Oh yeah, this time I decided to include our girl Lisa. In my last video, I didn't mention her, but I got tons and tons of comments reminding me of her 15% defense down. So thanks to everyone for being kind about that and bringing it to my attention. Now our mixed build is going to be the exact same, except we are going to be using a Cryo Goblet instead. For our Cryo Infusion comp, we are going to be using Zhongli, Chongyun, and an Animo character with the 4-piece Viridescent set. This is going to provide us with 20% shred, 8% cryo res down, a little bit of extra attack speed. Now this might actually give us a couple more stacks on our elemental burst. We'll have to test this when she actually releases. And then the 40% res down from the 4-piece Viridescent set. We are also going to be using a Black Cliff Slasher because we are using a 4-piece Blizzard set. A pretty nice cheap build for those that lack crit rate, and for those that end up getting pretty unlucky from farming the Pale Flame set dungeon when that comes out. And this is kind of the goal of the video, to answer the question of, is this build going to stack up to the physical set? Since this build is relatively easy to build and much cheaper than a full physical set. you may already have some Blizzard pieces laying around, and crit rate being taken care of by the 4-piece set is pretty nice. With this particular team comp setup, we aren't freezing, so we aren't taking full advantage of the 4-piece Blizzard set, but we can decide to swap out Zhongli for Xingqiu if we really want to. For the calculations in this video, I will however be using Zhongli. And so, with all of that said, let's jump into the calculations and the charts and graphs. And according to this graph, the Cryo Infusion comp is actually doing comparable damage to the Omega Full Physical comp. So does this mean the Cryo Infusion comp is actually viable? The answer to that is no. And for a very important reason, as I outlined before we looked into this. The first is that you can see this damage is only when the Black Cliff Slasher has 3 stacks. And also included in this graph is all of the melt damage when Eula is able to melt her elemental skills and her elemental burst. And because Eula is going to have such a hard time targeting her melt damage, the numbers and the graph that we're seeing here is actually quite misleading. Only if we get a character that can apply Pyro as fast as Eula can apply Cryo, then we are not actually going to be seeing these numbers. However, in the future, if there is a character that can apply Pyro faster than Eula can apply Cryo, then this comp actually becomes a very viable option for C0 Eulas. But in the game's current state, Cryo Infusion is not going to stack up to the Omega Full Physical build. And if we really think about it, this damage is actually not surprising because we are enhancing our Cryo damage so much. So it makes sense that the melt damage in turn is also going to be pretty high. One thing to note here is that if we are going for a melt style Eula, then we probably don't want to run 4-piece Blizzard set because we're going to be melting instead of freezing. Instead, you might consider going 2-piece Blizzard with 2-piece Gladiator or 2-piece Wanderer set. So if we remove melt damage from the chart, we end up with a graph looking like this. And you can clearly see that the Cryo Infusion is significantly weaker than both the mixed set and the Omega Full Physical set. So this graph is much more practical and probably what you'll be seeing in the game. With all of that said, however, I'm still going to try out this comp and see if I can clear the game's content. And of course by content, I mean the Spiral Abyss. And speaking of Spiral Abyss, since the Cryo Infusion comp uses the Black Cliff Slasher, this build might actually end up being even weaker. This is because the Abyss is seemingly being updated with floors that only have 1 enemy. And if the Black Cliff weapons can't get their stacks, then they're going to be much weaker. And then there's one more graph to share with you guys, and this chart is going to show you guys how each part for kit performs depending on which artifact set we use. So feel free to pause this and take a look. But in essence, we can clearly see that the full physical set wins in all forms of physical damage, which is obvious, and the Cryo Infusion is going to win in terms of all forms of cryo damage. And then the mixed set is the happy medium between the two. This is true for everything except her normal attacks because we either infuse it with cryo or we buff the ever-living hell out of our physical damage. So the mixed set actually ends up being the lowest. And so even though we can see these bars, we don't actually know the true difference between the damage. So I went ahead and took the percent difference for each part of our kit. So when we compare the physical set to the Cryo Infusion set with 3 stacks, you can see a pattern. The difference in damage for our normal attacks is about 7.5% in favor of the physical. So there's not a huge difference there, certainly a difference, but not as big as the other ones we're going to see in just a bit. When it comes to all of our cryo damage and melt damage, there is a 60.45% difference in favor of the cryo set. And then when it comes to her physical damage that comes from the Lightfall Sword, there is going to be an 80% difference for the base damage, a 71% difference when you have 10 stacks, and then for her passive, there's about a 64% difference. Alright, so that's pretty much all I have for you guys in this video. The Cryo Infusion build is definitely going to be much weaker than the full physical sets for 2 very distinct reasons. The ability to melt our high damaging cryo moves is going to be difficult, and the Black Cliff weapons are going to be significantly weaker when the Abyss drops with floors containing only 1 enemy. At the end of the day, however, if we can clear the Abyss with the set, then it doesn't really matter because the end result is the same. So anyway guys, if you made it this far in the the video, thank you so very much. I hope you learned something or that this was interesting to watch. And if you did, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, see ya.